October 23, 1940. It was a cold night in Philadelphia when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt stepped out of his car and into the convention hall. With just a month until the votes would be counted, FDR was to deliver a campaign address to sway the public into re-electing him for a record third term. However, just 5 months prior, the president had expressed in private that he did not want to run for re-election after his second term was up. And if it wasn't for the looming Nazi threat sweeping through Europe towards Great Britain, he most likely would have done just that. But Roosevelt's respectable sense of duty simply wouldn't let him. FDR's speech in Philadelphia that night was attended by thousands and was quite well received overall. He concluded with a reiteration of his party's main promise to voters.
We will not participate in foreign wars, and we will not send our army, naval, or air forces to fight in foreign lands outside of the Americas, except in case of attack.
FDR ended up winning by a landslide and was elected into his third term in office that November. It was clear by his overwhelming victory margin that the American people were behind his stance on the conflict in Europe. Nobody wanted war, unless we were pushed into it. You can probably already guess what happened a little over a year later. On December 7th, 1941, FDR was finishing up lunch in the White House when a call came through from the Secretary of the United States Navy. The Pearl Harbor Naval Base in Hawaii had just been bombed to smithereens by the Japanese Air Force. It was a blatant declaration of war. Many in the Japanese government, who were feeling pretty good after bullying smaller Asian countries during the war, felt they were up to the task of war with the United States. Bombing Pearl Harbor, they thought, would cripple the United States Navy and thus give them a huge advantage in the Pacific. Japanese Navy Admiral Yamamoto, who planned the attack at the request of his government, was one of the few that was hesitant in initiating war with the United States. While there is some speculation as to whether or not he actually said this, a film depicts him saying, December 8th, 1941, the US declared war on Japan, and in doing so had now joined World War II on the side of the Allied powers. Roosevelt correctly declared the December 7th bombing of Pearl Harbor as
a date which will live in infamy.
Wartime had once again arrived in the United States. For the next 4 years, the Allies fought tooth and nail against the Axis powers, slowly gaining victory over each one as time went on. In April of 1945, FDR died in office during his fourth and final term, never getting to witness the end of the war that he had long overseen. His successor, President Harry S. Truman, would be the one to see the end of the war and deal with the fragments it left behind. Just a month after his death, Germany finally surrendered. And while that should have ended the war right then and there, Japan was not about to give up yet. By that point, the United States had spent 3 years fighting the Japanese by way of multiple island-hopping campaigns. One by one, the US crept closer and closer to the Japanese mainland, until finally, on June 22nd, the Allies officially captured the island of Okinawa, placing them right on Japan's doorstep. But ending the war in mainland Japan was going to be the most difficult task the United States had yet to face. You see, the resolve of the Japanese people was an unflinching and morbidly admirable force of nature. Japan as a nation was incredibly devout in terms of their homeland, and whose culture took intense pride in honoring one's country. Bushido, or the way of the warrior, was so ingrained in the Japanese psyche that Japanese military officials would literally disembowel and murder themselves in the face of defeat rather than surrender to the enemy. Soldiers who returned home alive were considered dishonorable and were outcast by society. To the Japanese, dying in battle was more honorable than surrendering and living. So, even with the war essentially over, Japan was seen by the world as a country that would have to be fully invaded in order to be beaten. The United States had a decision to make. Would they, now, surely near the tail end of the war in their eyes, really have to send potentially over 1 million more young Americans to die overseas in a full-scale invasion of the Japanese mainland? Again, the Japanese would have fought harder than anyone on the planet to protect their country. Invading them would have been a grotesque and bloody conflict even by World War II standards. So, with the US government desperately wanting to avoid another invasion by land, a swifter, alternative way to end the Japanese-American conflict was brought to the table. That alternative had to do with the work of one Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer. J. Robert Oppenheimer, as you probably already know, led a team of scientists that was tasked by the United States government to develop a nuclear bomb, a type of bomb that was more devastating and more destructive than anything human civilization had, and arguably still has, ever seen. The nuclear weapon the United States had created was capable of wiping out literally hundreds of thousands of people, as well as entire cities, all within the blink of an eye. The creation of this nuclear bomb began years earlier in 1939. Albert Einstein, along with the US government, raced to develop the most destructive weaponizable force the world had ever seen, because if they didn't, someone else would. Whoever was able to detonate the first nuclear weapon in history would automatically have a war monopoly over everyone else, something the Allies could not let Germany and the Axis powers have. By the time the Trinity test was successful and Oppenheimer's monster was ready for use, Germany had already surrendered. Germany's surrender in 1945, had it not been spurred on by boots on the ground, would have happened inevitably due to it being the nuclear weapon's initial target. With their top secret weapon now being ready, the United States military, led by President Truman, had a historically difficult decision to make. The administration had estimated that invading Japan would cost 1.7 million Americans' lives and 10 million Japanese lives. Should they send countless more American troops to slaughter on the island of Japan, or should they make the grossly unethical decision to wipe out hundreds of thousands of innocent Japanese citizens? After much deliberation, the United States decided that they would drop 2 nuclear bombs on Japan, once to prove they could do it, and then again to prove that they could keep doing it until Japan itself was flattened. Before actually dropping the bombs, the United States gave vague warnings of total destruction to Japan if they did not give up their war effort. Japan didn't take heed of their warnings though. They, understandably, didn't believe that the destruction the US threatened them with was humanly possible. The world just hadn't seen something like a nuclear weapon before. Japanese weather stations on the morning of August 6, 1945, remarked how peaceful the air was that day, completely clear and windless. Even in wartime Japan, Hiroshima's 255,000 citizens went about their days as usual. In the sky above, though, a figurative storm was well on its way. An American aircraft called the Enola Gay was 6 hours into flight and rapidly approaching the Japanese mainland. The plane's pilot, Paul Tibbets, was carrying the Little Boy nuclear bomb aboard his craft. This bomb, developed by Oppenheimer, had the power of 15,000 tons of TNT and could produce a fireball equal to 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. For reference, the temperature of the sun is 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The shockwaves from such a bomb literally transcend the speed of sound. This weapon could decimate everything in about a mile's radius of its landing zone, and leave behind a lethal radiation zone even further. Tibbets, who would later go on to say he was proud of being the one to drop the bomb, did so at exactly 8:15 a.m. local time over the densely populated city of Hiroshima, Japan. What immediately followed the bomb's dropping was something mankind had never seen before. A complete eradication of a city in the blink of an eye. 80,000 Japanese citizens died instantly, many of whom had been consumed by the fireball to such an extent that they literally disappeared from this earth entirely. When it was said and done, an estimated 60,000 more died over a short time after the fact. It's hard to put such destruction in words all this time later. Here is an aerial view of Hiroshima before and after the bomb was dropped. Roads and buildings and homes became fields in seconds. A city that had been developed over the course of 356 years was decimated in the blink of an eye. As horrible as this already was, at 11:02 a.m., the day of August 9th, the Fat Man nuke was dropped over Nagasaki, another densely populated Japanese city. Usually thought of as just another city that was bombed, the destruction of Nagasaki was as much of, if not more of, a hellscape as Hiroshima's. The bomb that detonated in Nagasaki was actually 40 times more powerful than the one in Hiroshima. Cities decimated, families obliterated. 80,000 perished in Nagasaki after the 140,000 had in Hiroshima. The horrors of what the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki saw after the bomb's initial shockwave were essentially hell on earth. In fact, many who survived the initial bombing recall thinking that they had perished and gone to hell, when in reality they were very much alive in the cities they stood in seconds prior. The horror and pain of what happened that day in Japan is never ending. Nobody in Japan could ever forget what happened to them or their ancestors on that August morning in 1945. With over 200,000 estimated casualties having been accumulated, the Japanese government now had to consider what they'd always avoided. Debates on what to do next carried on throughout that night into the morning of August 10th. month. After being convinced by the unbelievable destruction the bomb had caused, Japanese Emperor Hirohito declared Japan must bear the unbearable and surrender. On August 15th, Hirohito announced to the world that Japan would be surrendering to the United States. He referred to a new and most cruel bomb as being the main reason for their surrender. To avoid using the word surrender, Hirohito famously said, "The war has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage." Like the emperors, the world's collective realization that this was the level that warfare advancement had come to must have been horrifying. It still is. Wiping out massive chunks of a country's population within hours was now something that could realistically happen. The nuclear bottle had been opened and the lid could never be put back on. Douglas MacArthur, a military legend and 5-star general of the army, had been the man to oversee Japan's initial surrender. 2 weeks following Japan's formal surrender on September 2nd, 1945, MacArthur was effectively put in charge of the American occupation of Japan. The Supreme Command of Allied Powers, or the SCAP, was now the ruling force in a post-World War II Japan. The Japanese people were now very well aware of their defeat in the war, and there was, understandably so, a lot of fear and major animosity towards their new government. As we've already covered, the Japanese have deep roots in Bushido and honor. Losing the war was a terribly difficult thing for the Japanese, but to then have your home occupied by your victorious opponent who had just annihilated hundreds of thousands of your friends and families was something far worse. One of the first things the SCAP sought to do was change the way Japan operated. The United States wanted to make sure Japan wouldn't go to battle with them again, but at the same time, they couldn't rule over them forever. What they needed was to make sweeping changes to the emperor-ruled Japanese government structure that had started the war in the first place. As would happen in Berlin a few years later, the SCAP spoon-fed the government a healthy dose of democracy. Many in the government who had been around since the beginning of the war were sent away, and the emperor himself was stripped of much of his power, though he was still allowed to be emperor in name only. While the SCAP made hefty changes on a government level, they knew it wouldn't be enough to change the country profoundly. Changing Japan socially was part of their plan too. While they made changes seen as good today, like women's right to vote, trade unions, and education reform, other changes are not viewed as exactly favorable. Because the SCAP sought to undo things seen as anti-democratic, censorship was rampant. While undoing propaganda films shown at the cinema was an objectively good action, replacing them with films endorsing America and Western society feels forced. Instead of letting Japanese film companies take a different direction, the industry was invaded and overseen by the SCAP for the duration of American occupation. While the film industry exploded in Japan after the SCAP's reforms were made, cinemas who had just been freed from a strict government were now being told what they could and couldn't make again. The key takeaway from the American occupation of Japan is that any circulation of media regarding Hiroshima and Nagasaki was strictly prohibited. The SCAP felt that hurriedly moving past the atrocities that had unfolded in those cities would speed up their efforts. So, obviously, no films in Japan were allowed to talk about the nuclear weapons or their continuing effects on the Japanese people. The American occupation of Japan officially ended on April 28, 1952 with the signing of the San Francisco Treaty, though the SCAP's exit from Japan was hardly the end of Japanese suffering. To date, the United States has conducted 66 nuclear weapon tests near the Marshall Islands, which makes the area still their most used testing site. On March 2, 1954, 8 years into testing near the Marshall Islands, the notorious Castle Bravo incident occurred. To put it short, the thermonuclear weapon named Castle Bravo is still the largest nuclear bomb detonation the United States has ever done. Take the bomb that decimated Hiroshima, the utter destruction that it caused. The Castle Bravo nuclear weapon was literally 1,000 times more powerful. 1,000. Castle Bravo had the power equal to 15 megatons of TNT to the little boy's 15,000 tons. But here's the thing. The United States did not expect the bomb to be so destructive. The United States was anticipating only a 6 megaton explosion. The fallout from the incident was severe. Traces of radiation from the explosion were found in countries all over the world. Worse, the nearby Bikini Atoll region was completely contaminated, and to this day it is not safe to be inhabited. 100 islanders were displaced from what was their home. A Japanese fishing boat named Lucky Dragon No. 5 happened to be in the area when the detonation occurred. Because the Castle Bravo bomb wasn't expected to be as powerful as it was, no one bothered to alert the crew of its impending detonation. After seeing a great white flash in the sky, the crew was covered in black, radioactive ash, and all experienced a myriad of health issues. At least one crew member died as a result of direct radioactive exposure. The rest experienced illness, bleeding gums, hair loss, and other ailments. Subsequent reports of the detonation and Lucky Dragon No. 5's contamination shocked and angered Japan. Many in Japan have called it the second Hiroshima. With the war and American occupation over, the people of Japan had been hopeful the days of reading about nuclear weapons harming their country and people were behind them. Alas, they were not. Despite the disaster, Japan by now had moved forward out of the darkness that was World War II and been changed fundamentally. The militaristic country that had been ruled by an emperor was now a democratic society with new Western ideas. The Japanese people were now more free than they had ever been before. The film industry was now drastically different and free to make films as they pleased for the first time in their history. In 1954, only 9 years after the first ever nuclear bombs had decimated Nagasaki and Hiroshima, a Japanese film company wanted to finally illustrate the immense pain their country had felt since that day. They were going to candidly give a representation of Japan's real outlook on nuclear weapons, their use, and their consequences on the world. For Japan, it was time to talk about the elephant in the room. It was time to talk about the bomb. During the war and just after, Japan's film industry struggled. Famine, poverty, and the overall effects of the war left little room for the Japanese people to spend money on seeing or creating entertainment. In spite of the hardships they faced, however, the industry admirably pushed on. Toho, a film company in Japan, had been creating and distributing films since 1940. They too faced a harsh reality of the industry during wartime. Many employees were let go, budget shrunk, and less people turned out to showings. In 1954, Toho producer Tomoyuki Tanaka was in a plane flying over the Pacific Ocean towards Japan after one of their recent overseas projects in Indonesia had been cancelled. Looking at its flight path on Google Earth, he would have been looking at Bikini Atoll, the location of the Castle Bravo disaster that had just occurred. Tanaka, already thinking of the Lucky Dragon No. 5 victims just as everyone else was, imagined what it would be like if a huge monster burst out from that sea. Tanaka decided on that plane ride that he wanted to make a kaiju film, aka a giant monster film. While he was already influenced to make one after seeing King Kong and the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, Tanaka wanted his monster to poetically illustrate the damage of the nuclear bombs on Japan. Tanaka wanted this monster movie to mean more. Arriving back in Japan, Tanaka and special effects director Eiji Tsuburaya immediately began working on bringing the monster to life. While the creation of Godzilla's name is said to have come about in many different ways, it is generally accepted that it was all Tanaka. Inspired by King Kong as well as the sea, it is said that Tanaka merged the Japanese words for whale and gorilla together and eventually settled on Gojira. While in Japan, Gojira is the monster's actual name, the Americanized version of it came to be the commonly used Godzilla. Godzilla's early looks were funny looking back now. A skinny, more humanoid-looking version of Godzilla is seen frequently when looking back at early storyboards. Eventually, art director Akira Watanabe and sculptor Tezo Tshishimitsu created a version of Godzilla that was accepted by Toho. Godzilla's charred and grooved skin was meant to mirror nuclear bomb victims' keloids from severe exposure to radiation. Godzilla's size was also attributed to nuclear radiation, as Tanaka said, Japanese people back then had a great fear of radiation, which is what gave Godzilla his enormous size. Now that Tanaka had his monster, he needed someone to help write and also to direct it. Tanaka originally had other directors in mind, but many had passed on the project. Many of those directors saw kaiju films as being silly and did not want to be associated with them, much less one that was trying to be serious. After some time, a man by the name of Ishiro Honda ended up with the job. Honda, who is now a legendary figure in Japanese film, was a director lower on the totem pole within Toho that had actually fought in World War II years prior. A big part of Honda being tapped for the job was that experience, as well as his stance on nuclear weapons. Honda said, "When I was coming back from the war, as the army was returning after our final defeat, we passed through Hiroshima. Back then, it was said that for the next 72 years, not a single blade of grass would grow there, and that really stayed with me. So I have kind of a hatred of nuclear weapons." Tanaka, knowing Honda's outlook on the war and the bomb, trusted that Honda would take the film very seriously and set that dark and serious tone that he wanted. Honda has looked back on the production of the film and reinforced the atmosphere they created, saying, "There's one thing I still haven't forgotten. Tsuburaya, Tanaka, and I just standing outside of the front gate of the studio and talking about how, when making this film, it was crucial that the crew have no doubt about what we were doing." After careful screenwriting and countless hours spent creating sets, casting actors, and all the other setup it took to make a film, it was time to record the movie. Overall, principal photography took 51 days and special effects took 71. Nowadays, this is nothing, but in 1954 this was actually a reasonable amount of time spent to shoot a film. The special effects of Godzilla are what remains the most impressive for 1950s standards. Stop motion was the initial preferred method for bringing Godzilla to life, but using that method would have taken years. Tsuburaya, the director of special effects as mentioned, pioneered suitmation for Godzilla instead. Godzilla would be portrayed by a giant suit. The giant suit worn by legendary Godzilla suit actor Haruo Nakajima weighed a ridiculous 220 pounds. While the suit is iconic and looked back upon fondly by Nakajima today, he had his battles with it. Due to the poor ventilation and scorching hot production lights, he could only be inside of it for 3 minutes at a time when filming. Over the years filming other Godzilla movies, Nakajima would have spells of fainting and severe heat exhaustion while wearing the suit. Despite that trouble, Nakajima came to be proud of being the actor behind the 1954 Godzilla and beyond. Looking at the film now, there's a handful of notable characters. Dr. Serizawa, played by Akihiko Hirata. Dr. Yumane, played by Takeshi Shimura, his daughter Emiko, played by Momoko Kochi, and Hideto Uraga, played by Akira Takarada. A popular complement of the 1954 Godzilla movie is the spectacular writing of these 4 characters. Typically, a kaiju film, even a serious one like this, has the sole focus of its production on a giant monster destroying cities. The 1954 Godzilla film, however, instead puts heavy focus on the human characters as well as its titular monster. The acting and interesting storyline of the human characters in the 1954 Godzilla film is what sets it apart from most of all of the following installments. After all the production was completed, the film was released to theaters nationwide on November 3rd, 1954. While initially being met with mixed reviews from critics at the time, the film was a huge monetary success for the 1954 film studio, earning $2.25 million off a budget of less than $1 million. Let's now enter the theater and review the masterpiece that is Ishiro Honda and Toho's 1954 film Gojira and what it meant for Japan. The film opens with a Japanese boat named the Iko Maru sailing the ocean during the evening, in reference to the fishing boat that fell victim to the Castle Bravo disaster months earlier. With that foreshadowing, it's no surprise to the viewer that the boat was swiftly attacked by something unknown and is lost to the sea in moments. In response to the boat's calls for help, Japan sent a couple more boats that way in order to rescue the sailors. Though all ships met the same fate to the bewilderment of the mainland dispatchers, no one was thought to have survived the sinkings, much to the immense heartbreak of the victims' families. The following day, Masaji Yamada miraculously washed ashore Odo Island, having survived what had happened. When rescued by the island natives, Masaji informs everyone that the boats were sunk for no explainable reason. Being one of the few people aware that a monster exists in their waters, a native Odo Island elder reasons that the attacks must have been made by none other than a monster named Gojira, though everyone is understandably wary of the elder's stories about such a monster existing. Helicopters full of reporters and investigators later arrive at Odo Island to question Masaji on his story and decipher how exactly the events could have occurred. With countless fish washing ashore during all of this, the native residents of Odo Island became increasingly convinced of the elder's story that a monster named Gojira was to blame. That night, a great storm hit Odo Island. The storm was horrible and stirred Shinkichi Yamada, younger brother of the surviving sailor, out of his sleep. Shinichi ran outside to witness the storm, and immediately after, his home, still containing his brother and mother, were crushed from above by what he described as a large creature. Now, the only survivor of Gojira's initial attacks on the boats had been finished off by that same monster. After the storm, a few witnesses of Odo Island's destruction were questioned on mainland Japan. After hearing their testimonies, renowned paleontologist Dr. Kyohei Yamane leads an expedition crew to Odo Island to survey the damage as well as their stories. Accompanying Yamane was his daughter Emiko and her boyfriend Hideto Orgata. They keep their relationship under wraps though, because she is simultaneously engaged to the hermit Dr. Desuke Serizawa, a troubled war veteran and a genius scientist. Serizawa is actually friends with Orgata, yet has no idea of Emiko's unfaithfulness. Upon arrival, Dr. Yamane encounters abnormal amounts of radioactive residue all over Odo Island's shore. As such, Yamane advises the islanders to not drink any of the nearby water as it is most likely radiated beyond what is safe to consume. The islanders are now left famished, as the fish they would have caught are also dead. The native Odo Island natives being left without food, water, and housing is especially alike the real-life native struggles in Bikini Atoll after the Castle Bravo incident. In addition to the radioactivity, Yamane examines massive footprints containing the same levels of radioactivity, as well as trilobite, as Dr. Yamane tries to figure out how on earth an extinct creature is suddenly non-extinct. The village alarms sound off overhead. As the crew and others all run towards the island's hills, a huge monster sticks its head out over the mountains in view of of them all. This is the first image of Godzilla shown to the viewer. Over the past 70 years, we've seen many faces of the monster in films, TV shows, and comics. But this first appearance of the monster Godzilla remains the most iconic to many. The crowd rushes back down the hills to escape the giant monster they faced. Luckily for the crowd, Godzilla didn't pursue them and presumably vanishes into the ocean. Dr. Yumane and his crew returned to Japan hurriedly and called an emergency government assembly into what had just occurred on Oto Island. Dr. Yumane told those at the assembly that it was a monster that caused Oto Island's destruction the night of the storm, and subsequently showed them a photo of that monster. It was while the photo was displayed to the room that Dr. Yumane gave the monster its more commonly used name, Godzilla. As a renowned paleontologist, Dr. Yumane reasoned that the monster must stand at least 164 feet tall and is most likely a prehistoric land and sea reptile. Due to the presence of the radiation in its footprint and sand, as well as the large prehistoric trilobite, Yumane theorizes that Godzilla was displaced from its environment due to the United States hydrogen bomb, aka nuclear weapon tests in the South Pacific. This presentation by Dr. Yumane perfectly delivers one of producer Tanaka and director Honda's central claims. The US's foolish nuclear weapon testing in the South Pacific continues to be a threat to Japan. Back in the film, after his presentation, a debate breaks out in the room about whether or not the world should be informed of the monster's emergence. A man in the crowd argues that the government should keep the existence of the monster a secret. He expresses concern that, since Godzilla is a product of nuclear testing, crying out about it could strain their already shaky international relationship with the world. Which, in real life outside this film, was actually very much the case for Japan. A woman in the room cries out angrily against Oyama, loudly protesting the idea of keeping the truth from the public. She reasons that by not telling the people, they'd all be sitting ducks if the monster were to come ashore. So it is ultimately decided that the public should be made aware of Godzilla. Immediately following the announcement, the military goes to shore to plant depth charges in hopes that they'd be enough to kill Godzilla. It was the aim of most all in the government to kill off Godzilla before any further harm was caused. However, Dr. Yumane disagreed. Yumane sat alone in his study that night with the lights off, brooding over what was to come of Godzilla. As a paleontologist and scientist, Yumane didn't want to see the prehistoric creature killed, but rather studied. Newspapers across the world warned of a monster being loose near Japan. On a train, multiple people are shown discussing the threat of a giant monster attack. One woman in disbelief says, "I barely escaped the atomic bomb in Nagasaki, and now this." A man nearby, clearly annoyed with the idea of evacuation, says, "Evacuate again? I've had enough." That night, Godzilla suddenly rose from the densely populated Tokyo Bay. With the depth charges proving powerless against the beast, the people prepared for the worst. Luckily for them though, Godzilla went back under the water instead of making landfall. While the paper headlines had been shocking enough, the monster making an actual appearance near mainland Japan caused severe nationwide panic. With the public now reeling, and Godzilla proving to be more resilient as once thought, the Japanese government ran to Yumane for further assistance. The Japanese government suddenly taking the threat of Godzilla's destruction more seriously than it was is reminiscent of their disregard of the warnings that the US gave them prior to the initial nuclear bombing being dropped on Hiroshima. When asked by the government if Godzilla was able to be killed, Yumane declared that doing so would be impossible. It is reasoned that Yumane both truly believed as such, as well as he may have been trying to save the creature's life by declaring him invincible. Yumane told the government officials, "Godzilla was baptized in the fire of the H-bomb and survived. What could kill it now?" Now the Japanese government realized that the war they'd been suddenly put into would be extremely lopsided in the enemy's favor, just like it had become towards the end of World War II. Japan once again was facing the threat of total nuclear destruction, only 9 years after the nuclear bombings on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. While the government was figuring out ways to stop Godzilla's imminent attack, there were quiet rumblings from an unnamed scientist in Germany that the aforementioned Dr. Serizawa had previously created a weapon of mass destruction, one that may be strong enough to kill Godzilla. A lone reporter named Hagiwara heard the rumor and thus sought out Dr. Serizawa's fiancée, Emiko Yumane. Hagiwara convinced Emiko to introduce him to Serizawa, so that he may find out whether or not such a weapon actually existed. After the pair arrives at Dr. Serizawa's residence, much to Serizawa's dismay, the reporter asked point blank if the rumors were true. The doctor sternly dismissed the notion that he had created any weapon and insisted to the reporter that this was all nonsense. The reporter seems to believe Serizawa and leaves soon thereafter. The doctor, now alone in the room with Emiko, is clearly rattled by the seemingly simple exchange. Emiko begged her fiancé to tell her what was troubling him so much. Serizawa made Emiko promise to never tell anyone of what he was about to tell her, and she did without hesitation. So, he revealed the truth. The rumors were true. He indeed created and harbored a weapon of mass destruction, one that was more powerful than any nuclear bomb. Serizawa walked Emiko down a stairwell into his laboratory. In it, he showed her a fish tank bustling with life. Serizawa then took a tiny ball of a mysterious substance and dropped it into the tank. Within just seconds, the water inside began to fizz up and turn a hazy white color. While this reaction occurred, Emiko screamed and buried her head into Serizawa's arms. When the water settled, hardly nothing remained of the fish that were perfectly healthy in the tank moments prior. The substance that Serizawa inserted into the water was what he called an oxygen destroyer. In short, this powerful chemical disintegrates anything living within a certain volume of water that it is inserted into. While still trying to comfort Emiko, Dr. Serizawa reveals to her that his invention's horrible abilities are purely an unintended consequence. He pledges to make sure that his creation never be used as a weapon. That is the reason that he had lied to the reporter earlier. This is the first we see of Serizawa's deep internal struggle with his creation, much like a certain J. Robert Oppenheimer's. As mentioned before, Dr. Oppenheimer harbored regret and inner turmoil for his hand in creating a weapon of mass destruction. The character of Daisuke Serizawa is hardly any different. Serizawa again asks Emiko to not tell anyone of what he had just revealed to her. Still distraught, she again gives her word. It's worth mentioning that, at this point in the film, Emiko had planned to reveal to Serizawa that she was in love with Orgata. Though, with the situation that had just occurred, she decided that now wouldn't be a very good time. This love triangle between her, Serizawa, and Orgata would have to remain under wraps. That night, Emiko returned to her father's residence with Orgata. Her father arrived home in a bad mood and sat down to eat dinner. Just after beginning to eat, alarms began going off in the town near them. Simultaneously, loud, ominous footsteps shook the ground beneath them. Dr. Yumane, anticipating this scenario, correctly declared that it must be Godzilla. Dr. Yumane bolted out of the room and out the door. Godzilla rose from Tokyo Bay and was met with the Japanese military frantically shooting tank shells at him. Undeterred, Godzilla kept advancing. Dr. Yumane arrived in the city and recommended that searchlights not be pointed at the monster, as doing so would only make it angrier, though the soldier he spoke to brushed him off and did not comply. Orgata and Dr. Yumane watched helplessly as Godzilla rampaged through Shinagawa Station. Godzilla picked up a train car full of screaming passengers and children by mouth and dropped it from hundreds of feet in the air. Another group of trapped passengers could only watch as Godzilla's foot came down on them, presumably killing them all. Godzilla knocked over bridges, buildings, and destroyed pretty much all of the city's infrastructure. The amount of people Godzilla killed in this incident is inestimable. Yumane and Orgata were left speechless as they watched Godzilla return to the waters of Tokyo Bay. The next morning, government officials devised a new defense plan, tried to electrocute Godzilla by sending 50,000 volts of electricity through 100-foot tall barbed wire towers. The government reckoned that when Godzilla again rose from Tokyo Bay, he'd walk right into them. Obviously, the threat of further civilian casualty is considered. Everyone that was within 1,600 feet of their massive perimeter would need to be evacuated. Almost immediately, thousands upon thousands of the area's townfolks began to leave in troves. Amid the bustling crowds, the military announces by radio that Godzilla has just been spotted not too far away and moving closer, replacing the towns that were once full of families where soldiers and construction workers. Tanks, armored cars, and cranes, among others, were being rolled into the ward area. The massive, far-reaching barbed wire barricades were constructed swiftly. It was wartime in Japan again. This time, though, they'd be defending their own shores. Stepping back to take a look, this is not even a decade after laying down their weapons for good. Japanese theater audiences were watching a Japanese military spring to action on the big picture screen. Japan versus the nuclear bomb was unfolding yet again, and the odds still weren't in their favor. This time around, Japan did not want war, but it was still on its way. The nuclear bomb had come back for them, and this time it wouldn't be satisfied by surrender. It was going to destroy them for good. While the military awaited the monster's arrival that next night, Orgata stood in the Yumane residence alone with Emiko. Orgata declared that tonight would be the night he revealed his feelings for her and asked for Dr. Yumane's consent for marriage. It was just after this that Dr. Yumane arrived home. Yumane was quiet and didn't even acknowledge their presence. He didn't say a word as she took his coat at the door. He sat at the table and continued to stare while reiterating that Godzilla should be studied, not killed. Yumane thinks that it would be wise to study the monster's resistance to radiation, which, to his point, is knowledge that Japan probably needs more than any other country at this period in time. Orgata, being a member of the general public, understandably disagrees with Yumane's pacifist views. Dr. Yumane recited his side of the argument. More passionately, Orgata stood his ground as well. Orgata iconically said, "Godzilla is no different from the H-bomb still hanging over Japan's head." Dr. Yumane had heard enough. He now saw Orgata as being on the side of the enemy. Yumane, disgusted, demanded that Orgata leave his house. It was probably then that Orgata realized that tonight might not have been the best night to ask for the hand of Emiko as planned. As their confrontation came to an end, a much more destructive one was coming about. The next 20 minutes of the film are perhaps the most memorable to audiences for better or for worse. Godzilla's ghastly destruction of the city is something Japanese audiences in 1954 had not seen images of since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Dark and gloomy piano music began playing over the film as Godzilla rose from Tokyo Bay and headed for shore. As the military had planned, the monster walked directly into the shoreline's electrical barbed wire. Yet, Godzilla was completely unscathed from the 50,000 volt currents. For reference, 6,000 volts is enough to kill an elephant. Godzilla had easily withstood 8 times that amount. As Godzilla entangles himself from the wiring, the Japanese military rains tank shells onto him. In a shocking turn of events, Godzilla opens his mouth and shoots what are basically nuclear laser beam clouds at those that were doing him harm. The defenses were completely decimated. Now, Godzilla was free to terrorize the city, and he did. His atomic breath turned over houses, burned buildings, collapsed bridges, and incinerated human beings. This scene literally shows a crowd of people dying instantly from it, disintegrating into the air. Amidst this awful destruction, I would actually like to take a moment to admire the music of Akira Ifukube. The score that he composed for this part of the movie is stuff of legends. When you hear the track being played today, you know this is Godzilla music. Ifukube composed all of the iconic music for this film and would continue to compose music for Godzilla films for the next 40 years. He is what John Williams is to Star Wars, the ultimate composer for Godzilla. His music really set the tone for a lot of the film, even as scenes as visually defining as these ones. The decimated cityscapes and burning piles of rubble displayed during Godzilla's rampage are shocking. If you were shown these clips from the film and told that they were of Nagasaki or Hiroshima, you might just believe it. I imagine audiences in a 1950s Japanese movie theater would have. The destruction that Godzilla causes the city in these scenes was meant to be reminiscent of the bombs. If the burnt cities and massacred Japanese citizens weren't upsetting enough, the scene I'm showing you now definitely is. A mother and her small children are crouched against a building as Godzilla's footsteps grow louder. Having seen what the monster has already done, even in the face of certain death, the mother tried to comfort her children. "We're going to join Daddy. We'll be where Daddy is soon." A news anchor and his crew are watching Godzilla from a television tower nearby. The news anchor is shocked by all of the towers of flames that had once been buildings. Narrating the events as they're happening, the reporter asks if the world will end because of Godzilla. To his astonishment, Godzilla made course for the tower that he was reporting on. The anchor knew that there was no way to escape and so kept essentially narrating his own death. With an almost silly final farewell and goodnight to his audience, the anchor and his news teams are killed. Dr. Serizawa is miles away at home watching the whole scene unfold on his television, while Maine and the others are watching in person from afar. After finishing off the television tower, Godzilla trudges back to Tokyo Bay and disappears again. What remained of the area Godzilla set foot in was next to nothing. Bonfires of both infrastructure and people alike were still smoking. A heavy haze was in the air from all the burning. Cities were reduced to fields of wreckage. Another bomb had been dropped on Japan that night. Bodies were carried away on stretchers, while those who barely hung onto life were treated in emergency shelters. Hauntingly, Emiko tries to console a little girl whose mother was presumably one of the many killed that night. The sight of the horrors that she had witnessed had pushed Emiko over the edge. She was going to break her previous promise to Serizawa. Emiko figured that the only weapon capable of saving Japan may very well be the aforementioned oxygen destroyer. Emiko pulled Orgata aside and told him all about the secret weapon that Dr. Serizawa had created. The film then shows a flashback to the day that Serizawa had showed Emiko the weapon. In it, we get some more important dialogue from Serizawa that reflects his attitude towards the oxygen destroyer. "I was filled with horror at the power I'd unleashed. If used as a weapon, it could lead humanity to extinction, just like the H-bomb." Serizawa told Emiko that he would give up his life and destroy his work on the weapon had he ever been forced to use it. Fast forwarding to the present, with the threat of Godzilla still ongoing, Emiko and Orgata left the shelter and sprung to Serizawa's laboratory. When they arrived, an emotional Emiko confessed to Serizawa that she had told Orgata all about the oxygen destroyer. Orgata then begged Serizawa to use his weapon against Godzilla, but Serizawa obviously refuses. A tense scene unfolds that ends with Orgata receiving a minor head wound from Serizawa. An angry and hurt Serizawa again stands on the notion that he would never put the weapon to use under any circumstance. In a gut-wrenching scene, Serizawa says, "If the oxygen destroyer is even used once, the politicians of the world won't stand by idly. They'll inevitably turn it into a weapon. A-bombs against A-bombs, H-bombs against H-bombs. As a scientist, no. As a human being, Adding another terrifying weapon to humanity's arsenal is something that I just cannot allow. Orgata, now bandaged up, is touched by Serizawa's words and begins to accept the doctor's wishes. As all hope seems lost, a TV broadcast of the ruined cities played in the laboratory. Although Serizawa had been watching the destruction live from the TV set the night before, seeing the aftermath in daylight shook him to his core. In a sudden twist, Dr. Serizawa agrees to use his oxygen destroyer weapon if it means that the destruction of Japan would end. Serizawa immediately begins destroying his research on the weapon before they all leave the laboratory. Emiko looks on at this emotionally because she knows that in destroying his research he will soon be destroying himself as well. The next day, many people and press gathered in Tokyo Bay aboard ships to witness the use of the oxygen destroyer on Godzilla. Emiko, Yamane, and Orgata are all present. Dr. Serizawa had his weapon in hand and told Orgata and Emiko that he'd be detonating the oxygen destroyer underwater himself, and so he needed a diving suit. Orgata initially protested, as he himself was actually a diving expert and Serizawa was not. In a compromise, it was decided that Orgata and Serizawa would dive down together to kill Godzilla. The pair dive into the water as Emiko and Yamane watched alongside the rest of the world. As the two descend into the murky ocean water and reach the bottom, Godzilla was stalking the ocean floor nearby them. Serizawa and Orgata backed into some rocks in wonder of the massive creature. With the weapon in position, Orgata is reeled upwards back to the surface by the boat crew, though Serizawa stays. Orgata helplessly yells out for Serizawa to return with him, though Orgata surfaces alone. Serizawa then unleashed the oxygen destroyer while still staring at Godzilla. The water on the surface begins to bubble, and Serizawa calls out to Orgata by radio and tells him the weapon is working. He then says, "I hope you two will be happy. Farewell." The importance of this line is sometimes oversought. Serizawa uttering this line ties off the love triangle that had been going on over the course of the movie. Emiko had tortured herself over not being able to tell the doctor about her and Orgata, but she now learned that she never have to. Dr. Serizawa already knew. A desperate Orgata continues to plead with Serizawa for him to resurface. The crew finally reeled in the last bit of reel attached to Serizawa's suit, but they found that it was cut by the doctor. Serizawa had cut off the reel and oxygen line moments prior in order to sacrifice himself to prevent anyone from getting information out of him about the oxygen destroyer. As the realization sets in on the faces of Emiko, her father, and Orgata, Godzilla rises above the water and lets out one final roar before turning to bone on the ocean floor and eventually dissolving entirely. Godzilla had been defeated thanks to Dr. Serizawa, though it was bittersweet for everyone watching because they had lost the brilliant Dr. Serizawa. Serizawa's death had brought an end to his suffering over the creation of the oxygen destroyer. It had brought an end to Godzilla and brought an end to the love triangle between himself, Emiko, and Orgata. It was all over. A stone-faced Dr. Yamane never broke eye contact with the water that was now the final resting place of both Serizawa and the monster. In the movie's final line, Dr. Yamane says, "If nuclear testing continues, then someday, somewhere in the world, another Godzilla may appear." The original Godzilla movie did very well in Japan during a rough time in their history and would go on to be presented in the United States, though heavily edited and essentially Americanized. This film is one that I hold very near and dear to my heart. This is a time machine in a post-World War II Japan stance on the bomb, and, in my opinion, one of the most important films of all time for that reason alone. Tanaka, Honda, and the rest of Toho were determined to make a film that portrayed the horrors of the nuclear bomb, and it did that very well. There's a lot to be learned from this film even 71 years later. The final line of the film is the overall message of the entire movie. Toho wants you to leave the theater with that line in your mind. That is, stop nuclear testing or you'll inevitably see destruction just as we have. Godzilla in general is a huge interest of mine, and I made this video to illustrate why the monster is so important to film history. While we all think of a giant lizard fighting gorillas and space aliens today, remember this film. Japan suffered a tragedy the likes of the world has never experienced before and may never again. Godzilla is the nuclear bomb, a monster, a force of nature that cannot hardly ever be killed, and ultimately humanity's greatest enemy. Over time, we may very well see another Godzilla appear, just as Dr. Yamane predicted.